This talk is called Weird Embodiment. Because it's called Weird Embodiment, I'm going to say a few things about weirdness to start off with. The word weird comes from the Old Norse root urt, which means twist or turn. A twist of fate, a strange turn up for the book, I'm having a funny turn. So when I say weird essentialism, I'm saying something like twisted essentialism or turned essentialism, or perhaps better, essentialism in a loop. This is what I discovered in the holidays that I was. I am a weird essentialist. And this is why this talk is called Weird Embodiment. And then I'm going to say that it's possible to think essentialism differently. And indeed this has been already tried, in essence, in the late 60s and early 70s by the so-called French feminists, but rapidly deleted by cynical reason. To do so, I shall make a distinction between essentialism and the metaphysics of presence. Essentialism here will mean that there are real things despite my thinking them or not. What is not necessary is that this reality be constantly present, underneath or behind appearances, or in Kantian, that is within dominant anthropocenic humanist paradigms sponsored by Heidegger, Lacan and Foucault, in front of appearances, insofar as my Dasein or my subjecthood or my discourse makes it real. This will enable me to draw up a logic square. Oh look, I already did it. In which there are four positions. Three are well established, and two of those three are very well established indeed, and one almost entirely ignored are possible. These positions are: 1, essentialism plus metaphysics of presence; 2, non-essentialism plus metaphysics of presence; 3, non-essentialism minus metaphysics of presence; and 4, the road less travelled, essentialism minus metaphysics of presence. And that's the one in red, because that's the right one, because I'm talking. In turn, this will mean that embodiment is not a case of being situated constantly and presently, but rather of shimmering or flickering. I'm going to argue that to exist just means to be a loop, a twisted loop, like a Mobius strip. A Mobius strip is a non-orientable surface. This means that every attempt to locate the twist on some precise region of the loop is impossible. There is no part of the surface that is not already twisted. This will be the same as saying that reality does not come with a dotted line and a picture of scissors saying cut here to separate, as Plato puts it, the eidos into its components like a good butcher. Butchering reality becomes impossible. Instead, the job of philosophy is to be a kind of Benadryl that enables me not to have an allergic reaction to a necessarily, as David would say, stranger. So let's run through the four positions on the logic square that I hold illustrates the basic ways of thinking about reality since Hume and Kant's underwriting of Hume, the basically what we call modernity, philosophically. At position 1, we have essentialism plus metaphysics of presence. Nature, for instance, is essentialist and constantly present, occupying position 1. So is reality, according to an eliminative materialist. There is a reality which consists of atoms or other tiny things which are more real than medium-sized things by dint of the fact that they are constantly present, if only for a time, while humans and spoons are just epiphenomena. We'll see that eliminative materialism is thus a reactive position within modernity, which is better exemplified by position 2. Position 1 is also exemplified by traditional Aristotelian and Platonic ontology, and also by some forms of pre-Socratic thought such as democracy and atomism, or Farley's notion that water underlay everything. Any form of reductionism occupies position 1. Crude position 1 assertions are the sorts of thing that Aristotle blew up. Things such as Anaximander's idea of the apeiron or Heraclitus' idea of fire as the most real thing that underlay the others. In many cases, contemporary materialisms map uncannily well onto pre-Socratic ideas, such that instead of Anaximander, we have David Bohm, instead of Anaxagoras, we have Arthur Eddington, and so on. Yet Aristotle himself also obviously occupies position 1 with his assertion that morphe is more real than anything else, and that this is the substance that underlies accidents such as colour. At position 2, okay, so that's position 1. Sorry, missed that one slide. At position 2, we have non-essentialism plus metaphysics of presence. At position 2, thought considers the enemy to be essentialism, but neglects to address the metaphysics of presence. In this position we find some forms of new materialism, and also correlationism. That being the post-Kantian consensus that there is no way for me to check, as it were, that the light is on in the refrigerator before I've opened it, which we'll talk about in a bit. Nietzschean theories of becoming, for example, which substitute a flux for static being, occupy position 2. So here we have Elizabeth Gross and Deleuze. There is no essence, but there is a flux that is more real than any instance of the flux, such as a milk bottle or a tiger. Correlationism also occupies position 2 for 2 reasons. First, there is usually an unthinking acceptance of some default ontology, such as Aristotelian substance accidents theory, Kant himself accepted this, or Newtonian space-time, or atomism. Since I can't talk about the thing itself, I can talk about my subject, usually a human subject, access to that thing. And yet, quite often, within that thought there is a cleaving to good old-fashioned substance and accidents. There is also the metaphysics of a constantly present subject that subtends and makes real the thing in itself. The subject opens the refrigerator, if you like, to see if the light is on. Or in Heideggerian, Dasein enframes or opens the world. This is not the phenomenal subject, me with my clothes and my habitual patterns and my hairdo, thank goodness, but rather the transcendental one, the giant invisible ocean of reason floating somewhere behind my head. This inaccessible subject is more real than phenomenal me, and I do not coincide with it. In this sense, correlationism, from Kant to Heidegger, does allow one kind of being to be weirdly essentialist, the human subject. Thus, Dasein is not strictly subject to the metaphysics of presence. Still, Dasein, in its copyright control of being, and German Dasein, as he says, is the best kind of Dasein, exhibits some of the troubling features of the metaphysics of presence. The journey from pre-modernity to modernity was the journey from position 1 to position 2. In the light of Hume, and Kant's grounding of Hume, position 1, assertions, including even atomism, strictly, begin to look like uncritically held factoids. Position 2 is disturbing because it admits a certain amount of nothingness into the conversation. Consider the reaction to Kant, called psychologism. Psychologism, this is sort of mid-19th century theories of logic, okay? Psychologism holds that logical assertions are squeezings of brains. Thus, logic is a set of rules for how healthy brains operate. Aside from the infinite regress of a brain determining whether a brain is healthy, we have the infinite regress of the idea all concepts are brain squeezings being itself a brain squeezing on its own terms. Psychologism, John Stuart Mill and others, thus tried to wipe out the nothingness that is the most interesting aspect of what Kant unleashed. This is why Husserl is interesting. He re-establishes the Kantian gap by arguing that thoughts have a logical form that is independent of thinking. Thoughts are sort of like fish swimming in the ocean of reason. They have their own logical DNA that is mind-independent. Thoughts are like fish, or viruses, or signs. Materialism, on the other hand, tries to elide nothingness. Ditto Hegel, this attempt to wipe out nothingness, the irreducible gap between phenomenon and thing, which I can't locate in phenomenal space-time. For Hegel, since I can think the phenomenon-thing gap, there is no gap. Thus there is a metaphysically present substrate of phenomena. There are no things, except insofar as they are subsumed by spirit or the absolute. Rather than substrate, perhaps it would be better to call it a superstrate. While position 1 favours reductionism, position 2 favours the kind of upward reduction that Graham Harman has christened overmining, rather than undermining. Thus, despite its supposedly progressive or courageous assault on essences, position 2 thinking simply tends to be a new and improved version of position 1, substituting a Heraclitean nature where everything is fluid for a reified nature in which everything is just real if it is natural. In position 1, a tree is a tree, while in position 2, a tree is a moment in the flow of becoming, or some kind of interactive process, that's Karen Barad's way of describing it, or an instant of tree discourse, or a thing whose reality is posited by an absolute subject. There is no essential tree, but my tree discourse, or Dasein, or history, capital H, or the relations of production, or the subject make the tree real. A tree is a refrigerator, and I have to open it to see whether the light is on inside. I realize it, and this realization is more real than the tree. Position 2 is ironically the position from which I deny the validity of, say, for instance, ecofeminism. Although many contemporary materialist feminists actually occupy position 2. This is because for position 2, certain kinds of ecofeminism or French feminism are bad forms of essentialism. So Karen Barad's thinking fits in position 2. Because it uses Niels Bohr, who applies Kantian correlationism to quantum theory as the architect of the standard model for which measurement is more real than measured things. Measurement at the quantum scale meaning interaction with other quanta. Therefore you can't ever establish that it's real. Hence Bohr's famous, there is no quantum world, unquote. Bohr argued that it made no sense to make assertions about what exists at the quantum level. In effect, he made position 1 statements about things smaller than 10 to the minus 17 centimetres illegal. It's not quite Protagoras, but perhaps it's a kind of post-human Protagoras. Not that man is the measure of all things, but that measurement is the measure of all things. At position 2, the solid seeming islands of position 1 start to melt and dissolve. So position 2 mistakenly thinks that melting and dissolving are more real aspects of things than non-melting and non-dissolving. In a way, position 2 just is modernity, trying to wash off whatever factoids it imagines lurking in the pre-modern view, in the same way that you wash your hands maniacally once you've escaped from the shtetl to New Jersey. You wash your hands, thus making you susceptible to a virus you have been coexisting with forever, polio. The attempt to have a clean body and a clean mind becomes a magnet for more virulent strains of virus and viral code. We will return to this theme. Then we have position 3, which I can't do justice to. That's a recursive deconstruction joke, I suddenly realise. Very briefly, position 3, which is non-essentialism minus the metaphysics of presence. At least here you are refraining from saying anything at all, since you hold that what comes out of your mouth will end up being ontotheology. Position 3 is deconstruction, and it has the virtue of refraining from harm, and of course this is my continuing lineage. I'm talking as somebody who backed into position 4 through position 3. But it has the vice of allowing scientism and other toxic forms of metaphysics to continue unchecked by abstaining from saying anything about reality, which leaves us with position 4, which is weird essentialism, or essentialism minus the metaphysics of presence. Existing in position 4 world means not being constantly present, as in deconstruction, where the process of making is subject to difference and so on. Yet unlike deconstruction, I can say that things do exist, yet they exist insofar as they are shot through with nothingness. In a sense, position 2 puts the nothingness of modernity in the wrong place. It believes that nothingness means that there are no things as such, only processes or discourses or history or Geist, and so on. Position 3 puts nothingness at the core of meaning, which is promising, since now at any rate I have decided that I can't make a definitive pronouncement. I have done a judo move on my modernity tendency to want to achieve perfect geostationary orbit outside of reality. My satellite camera is positioned to capture everything. But position 4 goes further. Position 4 puts the nothingness at the core of things. Toothbrushes, lizards, smears of protein and bubbles. There are things, says position 4, but I can't specify in advance what they are, so they are strange strangers, irreducibly uncanny. Since I can't put them in advance into a box called life or non-life, for instance, what appears is a kind of spectral playground, a sort of charnel ground possibility space in which all kinds of necessarily partial objects float about. There is no top thing, such as history or God or the subject, and there is no bottom thing, such as matter, and there is no middle thing, such as environment or world. Since there are no top, bottom, or middle things, there is no whole of which the things are all components. Thus things are necessarily partial. There is another sense in which they are partial, which is that these things are fragile. More on this in a moment. Position 4 is the object-oriented ontology position, and it's also resonant with some positions within French feminism and ecofeminism. There are things, but they don't come with a handy little dotted line that says cut here to separate the essence from the appearance. Yet the appearance is not the essence. So there is a weird essence that is and is not in its appearance. A thing is strangely physical and semiotic at the same time. Thus weird essentialism is fully up to speed with Kant. This is his example from the Transcendental Aesthetic. Okay, Kant, for whom a raindrop is a raindrop, not a gumdrop, alas. But for whom raindroppy phenomena I feel as wet droplets on my head, or even raindrop ideas I can think about, are not the raindrop itself. Yet we have also decided that I am not the referee of realness, the adjudicator of who gets allowed into the realness equivalent of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. To do so would be to fall into position 2, since for position 2 there is an underlying metaphysics of presence, a presence that resides in the adjudicator. In a way, position 2 is desperately trying to contain the explosion of things in the Anthropocene, which is the historical equivalent of the philosophy I've been describing when I talk about Kant. Fossils, evolution, geological time, biosphere, climate, capital, life forms without species or genus. It is trying to contain this explosion by restricting realness to some kind of magical adjudicator or to some kind of underlying flux. Position 4 is not reactive against modernity. I cannot assert that there are things and that these things are truly constantly there, like position 1. Lubricated by position 3, I can instead say that there are things and yet there is no top thing, no reality adjudicator. Another way of saying this is that every entity has Dasein, which means that an entity does not occupy time or space, but rather times and spaces in such a way that it is weirdly strung out, as in the case of a tiny yet visible tuning fork in a state of quantum coherence, both vibrating and not vibrating at the same time. If you want to know more about that, it's a TED Talk, hooray, and a Nature article. The TED Talk is called Making Sense of a Visible Quantum Object by Aaron O'Connell. And the point is that they've managed to put massive, enormous things from an electron's point of view in a state of coherence, which shouldn't be doable from Niels Bohr's point of view. So you can actually see with the naked eye, this little tiny tuning fork is vibrating and not vibrating. So it's still like this, but it's not like that. And you can see that. It is both here and not here at once. It is not metaphysically present since it is breathing, unquote, that's Aaron O'Connell's phrase. Yet it is not just a processual blob that only looks like a tuning fork to me or to history. It has its own weird little vortex, its own weird little loop, a weirdly essentialist thing whose realness is precisely its trickster-like ability to be here and not here at the very same time. A thing is a twisted strand of the web of fate, which is just to say that it is made of the past. Form or appearance is the past. Yet a thing is also an uncanny stranger whose essence is distinct, yet radically unpredictable, withdrawn. This is the same thing as saying that essence is the future. If you really want to drop the metaphysics of presence, you have to drop the present. You have to drop the idea that there is a thing called the present, and that this thing is itself constantly present as a kind of atom of time, whether that atom is a blob or a block, or a tiny instant, or a billion-year eon. What we have instead is nowness, which is a weird relative motion between past and future, which is to say, a sliding between appearance and essence. A thing is a train station in which past and future slide past one another, not touching. Nowness is the quasi-relative motion of this sliding, and as a meditator or a tiny tuning fork in a state of quantum coherence will tell you, the present as a static frame is just an arbitrary construct that you can specify to arbitrary proportions. Nanosecond, century. Meditation is perhaps then a magnifying glass in which we can absorb what it is like to be a thing. Nowness is a kind of between, which in Tibetan is bardo. And in Tibetan there is a bardo of living, a bardo of dying, a bardo of the state between life and death, a bardo of being born, a bardo of meditation, and so on. There's not much in between those bardos. To exist is to be in a bardo, which is to say is shifting in between state and that is neither present nor absent, neither living nor dead, neither awake nor dreaming. Again, the minimal form of this nowness train station is a Mobius strip, a strange loop in which, on the one hand, there is futurality. I wonder what will happen to my finger if I keep going around this loop, and pastness. Hey, look! My finger is on the other side of the loop, so there is only one side of this loop. But what is called present is just a plunging of my finger around a twist I cannot locate anywhere on the loop. The whole thing is twisted. The twist inscribes nothingness into the structure of the loop, so that wherever I am also not there, just slightly twisting over onto the other side of the strip. I feel that I am magically getting somewhere, that I am able to escape this side of the strip and miraculously jump to the other side, yet this feeling is automatically cancelled by my realization that I am always on the same side, and that there are not two sides of this strip, just that there is no gap between appearance and essence. If I just keep on driving my car, if I just keep on emitting fossil fuels enough, maybe I'll get to the other side of the strip, right? Modernity. Whenever I think I am close to the essence of a thing, I am immersed in the Octopocene of its appearance. Think of a Mobius strip, the sine qua non of a loop that is strange, a loop that appears to have closure, or is it incessant opening, or is it a weird twist of fate that keeps locking you back into the loop, only on the other side? Consider a virus. On the one hand, it is just a loop of physical things, just a string of chemicals. On the other hand, it is in a certain environment. Its host, which just is a sequence of DNA and its attendant ribosomes, it starts to become readable. It becomes semiotic. A virus is a partial object, a component without a machine, which is the logical precondition of all life, though not the chronological precondition, since single-celled organisms had to arise first. But the virus is a little loop that shows up the necessary incompletion of any single-cell system. A single-cell system must be fragile in order to exist, which is to say that it is capable of being hacked. In comes the virus and tells the DNA, in effect, that there is a version of it somewhere in the DNA sequence. This statement is called in logic a Henkin sentence. But while the DNA looks for the viral segment, the viral unleashes another kind of sentence, rather like the liar, which says this sentence is false. And this paradoxical sentence causes the DNA to go into a loop, making more and more copies of the virus. Death from influenza is when you have become a virus-making factory. You can become this because your DNA is necessarily fragile at the ontological level, namely incomplete, in the same way that in order to be true, a logical system must be capable of making sentences such as this sentence cannot be proved. For life to be life, a life form must depend on spectral beings that are neither living nor dead, but instead inhabiting a kind of goth possibility space, a kind of ontological graveyard in which all kinds of partial objects swim about. This is what happens when you start to think the world without metaphysics but with essences. It means that there is an irreducible play element in reality. I define play here along the lines of Bateson. When a cat bites you, it is a bite with a strange meaning. This is a bite, and this is not a bite. A weird thing in a strange loop, what some of us call an object. Thus it is looked down on by the constructivist spokespeople of anti-art, which is also an anti-products movement, the dominant mode of high art since the inception of the Anthropocene. The idea is to create the ultimate anti-product because, in the words of one sound artist, who really said this, he said this in France last September. I love listening to noise music because I can't remember any of it. On this view, good art is a kind of spinach, rather formless and nasty and good for you. Heavens no, not the sugary pop objects, not the sparkly things made of beauty and sadness. Keep them away. Better to have a disgusting thing that turns everyone off instantly, or write a manifesto about how making things always ends with a sellout. Now you can see why people have trouble with this philosophical view that I'm expanding here, calling it a version of commodity fetishism, and you can see why people have trouble with Sisu's fur coat and with the radical non-utility of Kantian beauty. Yet the spinach view of art is a resistance to modernity itself, insofar as I am cordoning off in advance what counts as beauty, what counts as an aesthetic reaction, by educating you in how to feel appropriately disgusted. This education must be authoritarian, and modernity is my decision that I can transcend what is given to me by authority. And insofar as the spinach view attempts to produce an infinite distance towards the art object, this manifold of attitudes allows me to resist the viral proliferation of commodities and the nihilism of the commodity form. Art and philosophy are ways of sobering up on this view from the drunkenness of modernity. Thus the ultimate art object is, as Derrida argues, a splat of vomit, a little punk pool of disgust. Art as disgust maintains a standard of taste, if only in the negative, which is why it is constantly struggling against beauty, against the seduction of the aura, against determinacy and the constraints of form. It resists the cognitive style of modernity, which just is awareness of a host of beings that are weird, not metaphysically present, not specifiable in advance. Disgust aesthetics, then, is position 2 in art mode, anti-essentialism plus the metaphysics of presence. There are no beautiful things as such, only more or less well-disguised splats of vomit, and my job as an artist or as an art critic or a critique practitioner is to ferret out the vomit to find the disgusting and the beautiful. My mortal enemy is the dreaded kitsch, which is an object caught in a human's narcissistic loop, which means that the condition for my mortal enemy is the narcissistic loop of the other. So my main job is to find narcissism and burn it. What happens when you take the boron rods out of the nuclear reactor of beauty, the rods that restrict beauty mode, which is Stimmung in Kantian, to the human subject? Recall that there is no good reason not to, since Kantian beauty just is a sort of object-like entity insofar as it is not me. I discover in my experiential space evidence for the wrongness of solipsism, and this evidence is called beauty. The beauty of the thing is ungraspable, yet it is somehow there, yet not metaphysically there, since I can't cut a piece out of the thing and say that this is its beauty. Beauty is a quantum, a thing that I can't slice up, yet it isn't an atom, atomos, uncuttable, since it isn't a little metaphysically present ball of something. Beauty is rather a weird coherence between me and a thing that isn't me, available in me as an object-like entity that again isn't me, and I can taste it and feel it, but I can't totally grasp it. This is the same thing as saying that the beauty mode is sad. Beauty has a melancholy flavour to it because of the ungraspability. And this flavour just is an object-like entity, the footprint of something in me. The necessarily horrible or disgusting proximity of a thing is a condition for possibility of beauty then, but beauty is a kind of allergy medicine, a sort of vaccine that consists of this disgusting thing in a loop. Oh, happy living things, no tongue their beauty might declare, which is to say, the water snakes in the rhyme of the ancient mariner are unspeakably horrible or unspeakably beautiful at the same time. It's no accident that the top affect of the first half of the Anthropocene so far, the Anthropocene being the moment that we're in, right? It's this intersection between human history and geological time, so that we can now find deep in Arctic ice evidence of the carbon emissions that we've been doing since the invention of the steam engine, a device whose patenting in 1784 led Karl Marx to say that's the beginning of industrial capitalism, because you have a general machine that you can plug into all kinds of other machines. And also leads Paul Crutzen, the atmospheric chemist, to say that's the founding moment, that's the beginning of the Anthropocene. It's really uncanny, right? Because you can say a geological period started in April 1784. It's no accident then that the top affect of the first half of the Anthropocene so far, the half called Victorian, is morbidity, since this is the result of realizing that, one, we coexist with thousands of millions of life forms that don't fit into a species or genus box. Two, geological time, which reveals a disturbing inhuman depth of these entities. And three, a derangement of scale, as Tim Clark puts it, that means that I can't be sure at what level I am seeing things, and I can't check whether my level is the right level. I could be looking at infusoria down a microscope, but who knows? Martians could be looking at me down their telescopes, and so on. This is the beginning of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. Anthropocentrism becomes absurd, like Wile E. Coyote suspended over the abyss, overwhelmed by the weird presence of things whose existence I can't specify in advance, and which are undulating from within with an intrinsic nothingness. I feel morbid, depressed, melancholic. I make things that correspond with this affect. They are routinely dismissed by high art as bourgeois or opiated or kitsch or pre-Raphaelite, all three, and so on. Since beauty is already a trace of not me within me, there is nothing stopping the beauty virus from going viral, as it were, and applying to interactions between all kinds of entities, between an oak needle and the grooves in an ancient record or wax cylinder, between a diamond and the silver that encases it in a ring, between algae and fungi coexisting as lichen, between this gravestone and the writing on it, between the mud and the foot of a dinosaur and my eyes seeing a JPEG of the footprint of a dinosaur in some mud. Beauty is the warning light in all these interactions that says, amplify this and it will destroy you. You run away from a disgusting thing, or you are transfixed by a horrifying thing, but you let in an ethereal or beautiful thing. You allow yourself to be seduced by the song of the siren. Unlike musical spinach, a great pop song lives in your head rent-free. An earworm, a literal parasite, a loop of viral code that you can't help playing and replaying. You have become infected by it since you are susceptible to it. Don't we talk about infectious pop tunes? Inside beauty, not opposed to it, is the sublime, which is the infinite depth of inner space, the fact that a weird thing is a TARDIS, namely, Doctor Who, the TARDIS, it's a thing that's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. The sublime is the active ingredient of beauty. It is the vertigo of nothingness, the fact that a thing just can't correspond with its appearance, and yet just is this appearance and not something else. When, for instance, I experience vertigo, I imagine myself flying. I imagine myself jumping off the height on which I'm standing. I realise that my inner space is far scarier than outer space, since I have the desire to fly, which is basically the desire to cancel myself out. All life forms down to DNA are trying to cancel themselves out, in the same way that Freud writes about single-celled organisms and the death drive. Only even viral code, even DNA, which is just a kludge of viral code insertions, virions and so on, is trying to unzip itself. The trouble is, it unzips itself in a protein environment that ironically causes the unzipping to make more DNA. The DNA is in a weird loop. It is trying to escape its fate, and in so doing it reproduces its fate. Because even non-life just is caught in the very same loop, which we know theoretically, since, as Freud argues, death comes logically before life. And this is because, why to talk about this is to do with modernity and ecology, and I'll talk about that later. Life is a rare form of death, as Nietzsche might have put it. Since to exist is to be inconsistent, according to weird essentialism, an entity is predicated on the possibility of its non-existence. And indeed it has this non-existence embedded throughout it like layers of sediment. This is not saying that all things are subject to entropy. It is saying that entropy exists because all things are fragile as a condition of possibility for their existence. And why is that? Because a thing is a physical system that is also a semiotic system without a convenient dotted line separating the two. Because a thing is a strange loop. Because a thing is riven between essence and appearance, even unto itself. A thing is a hypocrite, which is to say, an actor. Which is to say, that's Greek, hypocrisy. Which is to say, a being that does and does not coincide with her role or appearance. A thing is a form of delivery, which is the other definition of hypocrisy. A form of delivery of another thing. An MP3 is a hypocrite. A coffee mug is a hypocrite. A hypodermic needle is a hypocrite. A human is a hypocrite. A galaxy is a hypocrite. The universe is a teeming mess of halting, in the Turing sense, lame hypocrites. Hypocrites with nary a cynic in sight. To be a cynic requires a meta-language in which I can ascertain what counts as a valid statement or appearance. But since for any meta-language I can easily invent a viral code that causes the meta-language to break by exposing its fragility, there is, as Lacan argues, no meta-language, which just is the truth of the phenomenological project and indeed of ecological awareness. A thing is a hypocrite, which means that it is twisted into a strange loop. The very attempt to escape itself performs itself. Philosophy then becomes not the desperate search for a perfect cynical distance, which I hope you now see is just a reactionary regression from modernity, for all its avant-gardist sheen, but rather philosophy becomes a kind of Benadryl, allergy medicine to help me tolerate the not me that is me, and the not thing that is in a thing, that is a thing that is in a thing. Which is to say that philosophy is like beauty, and that both are an ecology of the sign. The philosophy of the post-modernity age is allergy medicine to allow things to, at the very least, coexist without trying to delete one another. This is not the happy nihilism of pure machination or eliminative materialism, but rather a dark nihilism with a funny twist. A nihilism of kitsch, if you like, a nihilism that doesn't delete the disgusting enjoyment things of the other in advance. Thus to exist just is to perform, not because there are no things as such, but because in fact there are things. To exist is to be engaged in a certain form of play, which as Gregory Bateson argues, has the structure of negation. A cat's nip says this is not a bite. There is a long conversation here in which one might tease out the relationships between queer theory, exemplified by Judith Butler's performativity, and French feminism, exemplified by Irigaray and Cicero. The weird double-edged thing made by combining these forms of thought is something like the weird essentialism I've been arguing for here. Reality, in the end, is a kind of drama. The haptic intimacy of Plato's cave exemplifies this. Strangely, it is the inside of the cave that promises something most closely resembling a weird essentialism. Now we're going to have a little chat about how this might relate to a specific kind of performance, namely the performance of contemplative forms of yoga. This is only because I've been writing about it very recently, and because some of you are interested. To begin this chat, let's talk about two different types of nothing. First, there is absolutely nothing at all, which Paul Tillich calls eukontic nothing. This is the kind of nothing you find in Spinoza. There is substance, and there is not even nothing besides substance. Then there is meontic nothing. This is a nothing that is more like a nothingness. It is a sort of something or other, but it isn't specifiable in advance. And there's something there, but it's not quite there. So meontic nothing is disturbing because it's palpable. It is not absolutely nothing at all. And this is the kind of nothing that I feel gets released by the Kantian underwriting of Hume. Okay? So there are raindrops, and they really are raindrops, right? And they're not gumdrops, right? And they're raindroppy. The raindrop phenomena is wet and splashy and cold and falling on my head. Yet whenever I look for these raindrops, I don't find the actual raindrops, I only find raindrop phenomena. So there's a gap between the raindrop phenomena and the raindrop thing, but I can't locate this gap anywhere in phenomenal space-time. And modernity, in a way, is a set of reactions to that, right? Denial, depression, anger, bargaining, acceptance. Meontic nothing is disturbing because it is palpable. It is not absolutely nothing at all. Imagine the universe according to Spinoza, in which there is absolutely nothing apart from substance, or the Deleuzian realm, in which there is no lack. There is not even nothing in such a world. On the other hand, a world in which there is nothingness is a world in which I can detect things are not as they seem. And I argue basically that all ecological phenomena are saturated with this. So for instance, I can't point to evolution, right? But evolution is downwardly causal on things like cats and fish. And when I look at a cat, I'm really not seeing a cat, you know. I'm seeing a concatenation of all kinds of things that aren't cats, that evolved to be cats. Nevertheless, a cat is not a fish, so I have a problem. Same with climate, right? Weather, the stuff that falls on my head, is a downwardly causal phenomenon of climate, but I can't directly point to climate. I can't see it or touch it, but I can think it and I can compute it. It's the same with evolution, right? So it's the same with capital, right? The Marxian view of capital, I can't see it or touch it, but it's downwardly causal on things like my paycheck, right? So it's real, but I can't see it or touch it. So there's a gap between the capital phenomena and the capital thing. Yeah? There's a gap between evolution phenomena, which is like cats and fish, and the evolution thing. And these things are just large and complex enough for me to detect the gap. And I'm saying the gap is also in coffee cups, spoons, and talks by crazy professors. Right? So that, for example, global warming, is just big enough and long enough for us to detect this gap. Right? So it has a 100,000 year amortization rate. Right? So that 100,000 years from now, 7% of global warming is still happening, right, being slowly absorbed by igneous rocks. Yeah? And this rate is a sufficient magnitude for me to detect the gap between the phenomenon and the thing, rather like a sort of weird way in which you can do a polymerase chain reaction and see a molecule really, 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 really big. If you magnify it using that reaction, you can see DNA, RNA, right? In the same way, when I study ecological phenomena, I'm studying under a kind of weird microscope this phenomenon-thing gap. So, a world in which there is nothingness, and a world in which I can detect that things are not as they seem. And the trouble with this is precisely what Lacan says about pretense. What constitutes pretense is that, in the end, you don't know whether it's pretense or not. Raindrops are raindroppy, not gumdroppy. Yet I find myself unable to tell for sure what this wet thing is because I am incapable of directly accessing the thing in itself. What this means is that nothingness is strangely physical. It is not physical in the way that metaphysics and the metaphysics of presence in particular specify. I cannot grasp the raindrop in itself, whereas for standard Aristotelian ontology I can do just this. Likewise, in post-Kantian eliminative materialism I can also do it. I can strip away appearances and be left with the thing simply by eliminating appearance. That's why I'm calling it happy nihilism, because it's a way of saying, oh, thank goodness, there's no nothingness, there just aren't minds. There are just brains. Thank goodness for that. The way the thing exists, according to both Aristotle and eliminative materialism, is a presence. It has a presence that constantly subtends the illusory or accidental appearance of a thing. Thus we might see eliminative materialism as a falling away from Kant, another reaction to him similar to Hegel's idealism, insofar as it disavows the anxiety of the phenomenon-thing gap. Fear of nothingness is fear of a certain physicality, a physicality whose phenomena I cannot predictably demarcate from its reality in advance. Thus we might hypothesize that this physicality has the quality of givenness. It is just there, yet not in a way I can grasp conceptually. Rather, it forms the necessarily disturbing substrate of my phenomenal experience, disturbing precisely because it is not just stuff, some kind of neutral stage set on which I strut and fret my hour. I experience such a givenness as a distortion of my phenomenal world. Something is wrong, out of joint, glimpsed out of the corner of my eye, a slight flickering. There appears to be some correlation between this idea, which is housed in phenomenological theology, and the Buddhist Prajnaparamita Sutra's notion of emptiness. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Eliminative materialism and idealisms appear to have little trouble with the first formula, form is emptiness. It is the second one, emptiness is form, that gives them trouble. The trouble is ironically also common to the experiential etiology of a Buddhist meditator. As Chogyam Trungpa puts it, form comes back. Reductionism and elimination make one feel clever, but what happens when the meditator drops her fixation on feeling clever? Or consider the frequently repeated slogan of the Soto Zen master Dogen. First there are mountains, then there are no mountains, then there are mountains. Is it not the case that what appropriations of Buddhism within eliminativist psychology ward off, and there are a lot of them, is precisely the third statement. What on earth could it mean? Nothingness is not nothing at all, so it is physical, but not in the sense of constant presence. Nothingness is disturbing. It is there, in a mind-independent sense. It is part of what is given, but I cannot see it directly. There is a weird crack in my world. Perhaps there is only one crack, the one between subject and non-subject. This is how Kantians and others, including Heidegger, police the gap by putting some kind of copyright control on it. Or perhaps there are as many gaps as there are things and relations between things. This is what object-oriented ontology has begun to think about the phenomenon-thing gap. A good example of weird embodiment in practice, then, would be Buddhist meditation, a strangely anxiety-provoking posture for some forms of Western philosophy, because it is about putting yourself, including your mind and your body, into a strange loop. This is Hegel's problem. He's obsessed with a statue that is actually a Hindu statue of Krishna sucking his toe. He thinks this is a kind of horrible sort of pretzel logic that defies, the dialectical progress, because it's basically A equals A, the night in which all cows are black. Is it perhaps the logic of Deleuze and Guattari's body without organs, a hypothetical being towards which they see humanity tending as capitalism continues what for them is its undermining processes? Deleuze and Guattari imagine the body without organs as a loop-like flow of energy within a sealed container, a flow that is not different from a certain eroticism. Some big quotations, so I'm going to cut. Is it really so sad and dangerous to be... I'm quoting them with some sense of quotation mark around the quotation. Not a Deleuzean. But it's an interesting quotation. Is it really so sad and dangerous to be fed up with seeing with your eyes, breathing with your lungs, swallowing with your mouth, talking with your tongue, thinking with your brain, having an anus and larynx, head and legs? Why not walk on your head, sing with your sinuses, see through your skin, breathe with your belly? The simplest thing, the entity, the full body, the stationary voyage, anorexia, cutaneous vision, yoga, Krishna, love, experimentation. Where psychoanalysis says stop, find yourself again, we should say instead, let's go further still, we haven't found our BWO yet. We haven't sufficiently dismantled ourselves, body without organs. Beyond the self-concept there lies this thing, this weird embodiment. Yoga, Krishna, love, experimentation, precisely. From this viewpoint, signification is being put into a loop, sewn back into objectile status. Right? Is this sewing up of the orifices, this closing in of the body on itself, not remarkably like this tantric text called centering? When breath is all out and stopped of itself, or all down and stopped, in such universal pause one small cell vanishes. Closing the 7 openings of the head with your hands, a space between your eyes becomes all-inclusive. Bathe in the centre of sound as in the continuous sound of a waterfall, or by putting fingers in ears, hear the sound of sounds. So I'm suggesting that esoteric language gets at this at a moment at which most philosophy is onto-theological, basically. The sound of sounds, in other words, we're talking about the Middle Ages. The sound of sounds is called anahata nada in Sanskrit. It means unstruck sound, a sound pervaded with nothingness, a sound that lies at the basis of all other sounds. The loop-like recursion of sounds suggests this weird, transcendental, yet physical entity. Thank you very much. We can have a discussion about that.